Picture this. A man walks into a room to choose a wife the way you choose a horse at auction. Two sisters have spent 3 hours rehearsing their smiles. And he picks the one who never said a single word to impress him. Why? Because the loudest room in England couldn't give this man what he actually needed, and the quiet girl in the corner understood that before he even opened his mouth. This is a story about what happens when everyone in the room is fighting to be noticed, except the one person who was actually paying attention. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. Out in Hampshire, the roads had turned to soup, thick enough to swallow a carriage wheel whole. But Lord Richard Alderton didn't care about the weather. He cared about one thing only, the man riding through it toward his front door. He stood at the window of the drawing room, breath fogging the glass, hands locked so tightly behind his back his knuckles had gone bloodless. "He's coming," he said, and the words landed in that room like stones dropped into still water. Behind him, his 3 daughters arranged themselves like pieces on a chessboard. The eldest, Charlotte, 24 and sharp as a blade, sat closest to the fire, needlework in her lap she hadn't touched in weeks, a prop, nothing more. She understood exactly what this afternoon was. A transaction. And she intended to win it. The middle daughter, Margaret, sat with a volume of French poetry open on her knees, though her French was shaky at best. She was the clever one, the one who could argue politics at dinner and play the pianoforte with the ferocity of a woman defending her life. If Charlotte was built to be admired, Margaret was built to be respected. And then there was the youngest. Eleanor. 20 years old, standing quietly by the sideboard in a dress the color of dishwater, not by choice, but because the fabric had run out after her sisters took the good bolts. She wasn't arranging herself for anyone. She was polishing a teacup, wiping a smudge from the rim with her thumb, waiting for the storm outside to arrive at the door. Because that's exactly what was arriving. A storm in the shape of a man. When the front door groaned open downstairs, Lord Alderton nearly leapt out of his skin. "Positions," he hissed, smoothing what little hair he had left, and marched out to meet his salvation. The Duke of Ashworth stepped into that drawing-room looking nothing like a man who owned half of Derbyshire. He looked exhausted. 31 years old, broad-shouldered, soaked through from riding the last 5 miles on horseback rather than sit boxed inside a carriage. Mud caked his boots. A thin scar tugged at the corner of his left eye, a souvenir from a war most of the room would never understand. He'd inherited the title only a year earlier, after his older brother's neck snapped in a hunting accident he never talked about. He hadn't been raised for velvet drawing rooms. He'd been raised for battlefields. He stood in the doorway and swept the room with his eyes, and it wasn't romantic curiosity. It was the look of a soldier checking a room for exits. Charlotte rose first, dropping into a curtsy engineered down to the angle of her collarbone. "Your Grace, you must be frozen through. The roads are dreadful this season." "They're mud," he said flatly. No smile. "Forgive me for tracking it into your home." Margaret went next, rising with a book still pinched between 2 fingers to look interrupted mid-thought. She mentioned crop rotations. She mentioned agricultural reform. She was reaching for something, anything, that might make her stand out as brilliant. The Duke's answer landed like a closed door. "My steward handles the rotations, Miss Margaret. I mostly deal in numbers." And then Lord Alderton waved a dismissive hand toward the sideboard. "And the youngest?" "Eleanor." She didn't rush forward. She simply inclined her head. "Your Grace," she said softly, and that was all. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than he'd held anyone else's. Then he turned back to her father and said he could only stay the hour, he had business in London by morning. An hour. Lord Alderton felt his stomach drop. An hour to marry off a daughter and save an entire estate from ruin. The Duke sank into the wingback chair by the fire, joints aching, the old wound in his thigh throbbing the way it always did in damp English weather. He hated the season. He hated ballrooms. He hated, most of all, exactly this, being paraded past like livestock at a fair while a desperate father tried to sell him salvation. But he knew why he was here. He needed an heir. His mother, the terrifying Dowager Duchess, had handed him a list of acceptable families, and the Aldertons were on it. Good bloodline. Bad finances. That meant gratitude, not demands. Charlotte hovered at his elbow, perfume thick enough to choke on. Wine, Your Grace. Tea, if you have it. I've a long ride ahead. She snapped her fingers toward her younger sister without even glancing her way. Eleanor. Tea for the Duke. He noticed that. The snap. The reflex of it. Margaret, not to be outdone, drifted to the pianoforte and launched into a punishing, technically flawless sonata, hammering the keys with the precision of a woman proving her worth through sheer force. In the low-ceilinged room, the sound bounced off plaster and slammed straight into the Duke's skull. He closed his eyes. His jaw tightened. This was a man who'd spent 4 years listening to cannon fire and dying men in the mud, and what he wanted now, more than anything on this earth, was silence. That's when he heard it. A soft clink of porcelain beside him. Eleanor had crossed the room without a single creak of the floorboards. She'd been watching him since the moment he walked in, the way he favored his left leg, the exhaustion carved under his eyes, the way Charlotte's perfume made him flinch and Margaret's playing made him grip the arm of the chair until his knuckles went white. He was a trapped animal, too well-mannered to chew his way free. Eleanor knew about traps. She'd lived in one her whole life. She'd noticed something else, too, while preparing the tray, that her family always drowned their tea in cream and sugar, a cheap performance of wealth they didn't actually have. But looking at the hard lines on this man's face, she skipped the sugar bowl entirely. A man who rides through a storm to get somewhere doesn't want sweetness disguising anything. He wants the truth of the thing. She poured it dark. No milk. No sugar. And she set it down at his elbow without a word, without a smile aimed at winning anything. He looked at the cup. Then at her. No sugar. You don't strike me as a man who needs a bitter thing dressed up as something sweet, Your Grace, she said, quiet and even, no flirtation in it at all, just a fact laid on the table between them. He picked up the cup. Drank. It was strong, sharp, cutting straight through the damp cold in his chest. It's exactly right, he said. She gave the smallest nod and walked away, back to her shadow by the sideboard, leaving him alone with a perfect cup of tea and a room that suddenly felt very different than it had 5 minutes earlier. When Margaret finished her sonata with a triumphant crash of the final chord, she turned, glowing, waiting for praise. The Duke set his cup down. I'm afraid I have no ear for music, he said plainly. Lord Alderton, sweating through his collar, pushed forward. But surely, Your Grace, a woman of accomplishment, a duchess must entertain, must she not? I have no interest in entertaining, the Duke said, and the room went dead silent except for rain lashing the windows. My home is remote. It's old, it's drafty, and I host nothing. A woman who needs admiration and a crowded calendar would be miserable there within a month. Charlotte forced a laugh, insisting he was exaggerating his isolation. He assured her, quite plainly, that he was not. Then he stood. The hour wasn't over, but he'd already made his decision. He'd made it 3 minutes earlier, in fact, the moment a cup of tea arrived exactly the way he needed it, from the one person in the room who hadn't tried to sell him anything at all. He looked past the fire, past Charlotte's beauty and Margaret's brilliance, straight to the girl in the grey dress. Miss Eleanor, he said, and the entire room turned as one. He asked if she played the pianoforte. She said no. He asked if she loved London society. She said she'd never been, and imagined it was loud. Something shifted in his chest, the closest thing to a laugh he'd allowed himself all week. He asked her one more question. If she were left entirely alone in a drafty house in the north, with no callers and no balls, how would she spend her days? Her father made a strangled noise of protest, insisting she wasn't even out yet, wasn't prepared for this conversation. The Duke cut him off without raising his voice, the kind of quiet command that comes from a man used to being obeyed on a battlefield. Eleanor didn't flinch. "I would walk the moors," she said. "I would read in silence. And I would make certain the tea was brewed properly." The room went utterly still. Charlotte stared at her sister like she'd sprouted a second head. And the Duke of Ashworth held Eleanor's gaze for a long moment, the transaction of the whole afternoon evaporating, leaving behind just two quiet people who'd recognized each other in a room full of noise. He turned to her father. "I require no further introductions. I've found my Duchess." What followed happened faster than anyone in that house could process. Behind the closed door of the study, the Duke laid out terms with the flat efficiency of a soldier handling logistics, not a suitor handling romance. He would clear the family's debts. He would fund repairs to the crumbling West Wing, on the condition they actually got done. And the marriage, no waiting, no lavish preparation, no London modiste. Tomorrow morning, a special license, and they'd be on the road to Derbyshire by noon. And one final condition, delivered with a chill that dropped the temperature of the room: the rest of the family was never to set foot on his estate. The allowance was their pension. Consider it the price of his privacy. Upstairs, Charlotte's fury filled the bedroom like smoke. "He's mocking us," she hissed. A duke, choosing the girl who pours tea. Eleanor, folding a worn shawl into a battered trunk, simply agreed. She knew exactly why he'd chosen her, not because she was remarkable, but because she was invisible, and invisible was exactly what a broken man needed. It stung, hearing it said aloud. But it was true. And underneath that truth was something her sisters couldn't see. For the first time in her life, someone had actually looked at her instead of past her. They married the next morning in a half-empty village chapel, and by noon the carriage was rolling north, 6 enormous grey horses pulling them away from everything Eleanor had ever known. The silence between them on that road wasn't awkward so much as unfamiliar, two people learning the shape of a life they hadn't chosen for themselves, only to discover it might actually fit. When the carriage hit a brutal rut and Eleanor gripped the seat rather than complain, the Duke told her she could lean back, that the upholstery wasn't glass. Small kindness. She noticed it. He noticed that she noticed. At a rough coaching in outside Oxford, dinner was tough mutton and sour ale, food he expected her to push away in disgust. Instead she ate it without complaint, mentioning almost offhandedly that she'd survived worse the previous winter, when her father's debts had left them eating potato soup for weeks. There was no self-pity in it. Just fact. He found himself unsettled by how easily she said it, and unsettled further by his own quiet relief that he hadn't married someone who would perform sadness at him for sympathy. When they finally arrived at Stonecliff Hall, it looked less like a home and more like a fortress braced for a siege: grey stone, narrow windows, wild moorland pressing right up against the gravel drive. The housekeeper, a severe woman named Mrs. Pruitt, made no effort to hide her disapproval of the plain, travel-worn bride standing in her grand entrance hall. The Duke informed her curtly that his wife would take the east wing, that he'd remain in his own quarters, and walked off down a dark corridor without a backward glance. Eleanor stood alone in a freezing, empty room 3 flights up, and felt something her sisters would never understand. Relief. No screeching rivalry. No frantic piano. No father pacing over debts. Just silence, and a room entirely her own, and a husband who asked nothing of her but her absence. For the first time in 20 years, she felt like she could finally breathe. But absence didn't stay absence for long. Eleanor refused to play the ornamental Duchess rotting quietly in an east wing. She took over the household ledgers and discovered the butcher had been overcharging the estate for years. She cut expenses by nearly half within weeks, not through tantrums, but through the same terrifyingly calm precision she'd once used to survive her father's collapsing fortune. She scrubbed hearths alongside the maids. She fixed the coal supplier's fraud. And every afternoon, she carried a single cup of dark, unsweetened tea into the Duke's study and set it down without a word, sometimes staying to glance at a map spread across his desk and point out, correctly, that two feuding tenants weren't fighting over grazing rights at all, they were fighting over water access, because sheep, as she put it plainly, cannot drink rocks. He moved the boundary line. The dispute ended. And something in his chest, long buried under mud and gunpowder and grief, began to loosen. Then came the storm. It rolled off the peaks in late January, black and furious, and by afternoon it had ripped one of the ancient gallery windows clean out of its frame. Snow and wind poured into the house like a living thing. The Duke ran for it with nothing but an iron poker and his own stubbornness, and found Eleanor already there ahead of him, dragging a canvas dropcloth and a coil of rope, shouting instructions over the roar of the wind like a general holding a line. They fought the storm together, side by side, freezing and bleeding and refusing to let go, until the canvas held and the wind finally broke. When it was over, he pulled her against his chest without thinking, wrapping his coat around her shaking body, calling her a fool for risking herself, and she told him, simply, that she needed him safe. The words slipped out before either of them could stop them, and they hung in the frozen air between two people who had spent months pretending this was only ever a transaction. He carried her down to the kitchen fire. He knelt and cleaned the blood from her knuckles with his own hands, in front of every servant in the house, and nobody said a word. The storm buried the estate for 3 days. And in that silence, not the cold silence of a house full of strangers, but the warm, muffled hush of two people finally, truly alone together, everything changed. Standing at a window one snow-bright evening, the Duke finally told her the truth, that he'd come looking for peace, and mistaken peace for emptiness. That he hadn't wanted a ghost to haunt his house. He'd simply been too broken to know how to ask for a partner instead. She told him plainly what she demanded of him, that he drink his tea before it went cold, that he stop working himself to exhaustion at 3 in the morning, that he let her fix the roof. And when he laughed, a real laugh, rusty from disuse, he kissed her like a man who'd spent his whole life bracing for a battle and had just discovered, impossibly, that the war was already over. He asked her to move her trunks out of the East Wing that very night. Not into a house with a duke and his duchess living politely apart, but into a shared life, under one roof, with one fire. By spring, the estate had a rebuilt window, a mended roof, and full coffers. Her sisters, back in Hampshire, told anyone who'd listen that poor Eleanor had been sacrificed to a monster in the cold, grey north. They never once visited to check. They were wrong about every part of it. Because on a quiet spring morning, standing on a stone terrace overlooking heather stretching all the way to the horizon, a duke who once wanted nothing but silence wrapped his arms around the one woman who had ever given it to him honestly, and found that the silence they built together wasn't empty at all. It was the fullest thing he'd ever known. If this story moved you the way it moved me putting it together, take a second to like this video and share it with someone who loves a slow-burn love story built on quiet strength instead of grand gestures. Subscribe if you want more of these historical romances landing in your feed, and tell me in the comments, who would you have chosen in that room? Charlotte, Margaret, or the quiet girl pouring the tea?